So, dear friends, our topic tonight is Lecture 9 in the Luke Gospel Lecture Series. This lecture has the title Christ and Maitreya Buddha. The Maitreya Buddha and Buddhism would have been popular items of interest to an audience of Theosophists in 1909. But Christ and Christianity would have been less popular or less familiar to a theosophical audience, unless the Theosophists were in the still rather small but very enthusiastic group of reformers who had been attending Rudolf Steiner's lectures in various cities, mostly in German-speaking Europe. When Rudolf Steiner became the General Secretary of the German section of the Worldwide Theosophical Society in 1902, there were 370 members in that German section. By 1909, the year of these Luke Gospel lectures, by 1909 that number had risen to about 1,500. An increase over 7 years that shows the popularity of Rudolf Steiner and Marie von Sievers in Central Europe. But this was still a very small number of members, given the popularity of Theosophy, which, at its height, had 100,000 members. Rudolf Steiner's audience was a small subset of Theosophy. They called themselves Theosophists, although this German section had begun to use the term Anthroposophy interchangeably with the term Theosophy to describe itself. Although they had begun to do that, the terminology was still theosophical, and folks outside the German section thought that it was all just Theosophy, call it what you like. Buddhist vegetarians was a popular insult and term of dismissal, even to the end of Rudolf Steiner's life. Rudolf Steiner was working hard to correct that misperception, but in 1909 he was still the official secretary and official representative of an official section of the Worldwide Theosophical Society. And since Theosophy prioritized Asian wisdom traditions, these wisdom traditions, especially Buddhism, were very much in discussion. Terms like karma, maya, akasha, these were basic theosophical vocabulary, borrowed from Eastern wisdom sources, to be sure, but given an original and distinctly European spin. For example, the term akasha, in the usage sense of Akashic Chronicle, comes from Madame Blavatsky and her colleagues. We find the word akasha in Sanskrit, but it is not used in the theosophical context of Akashic Chronicle or Akashic Records. The Akashic Chronicle is a Western theosophical coinage. There are other examples of Western theosophy rebranding words like akasha. And, some people do get exercised about this. But as a poet and a literary person, I find this sort of playing around with words and the wiggly nature of language to be a creative, poetic activity and perfectly fine. It accords with our human nature, I think. The Buddha did that sort of word sorcery as well. For example, he gave the words dharma and karma radically new meanings, quite different from their old Hindu contexts, and different from how Theosophy or Anthroposophy used the words, in fact. And as I said, for me, this poetic rebranding of words and playing around with terminology and meanings is part of the happy chaos of being human. And on that subject, Keep in mind that Buddhism, the word, is a Western colonialist term that world-conquering Europeans invented in the 18th century as a way to pigeonhole wisdom teachings they did not understand, nor would they really begin to understand those wisdom teachings until about our 21st century. You know the old cliches. And for many, these were accepted wisdom in Steiner's time. They are things like, oh, Buddhists are basically folks who can't abide the world. The world's all a lot of Maya and pointless suffering, and any sensible person, like a Buddhist, wants to escape this very bad situation ASAP and never come back to the screaming mess. While, on the other extreme, Western folks are here and now, deal with it, get over it, get it done, tough, loving pioneers. Westerners move forward and strive. Buddhists sit still and meditate. Buddhists talk about love and compassion. Christians really do something. Buddhists dawdle in a non-historical, dreamy fantasy time. Christian Europeans march forward and grapple with history and culture, capital H and capital K. We've all heard those old cliches, haven't we? And you know, they still bang around. Rudolf Steiner had begun his lectures on Christology with a concerted focus on the Gospel of John. His early and very important book, Christianity as Mystical Fact, which is critical for this subject, had laid a foundation for his later gospel lectures, such as the cycle of lectures that we are studying, that I'm speaking about. And in that book, Christianity as Mystical Fact, which is based on a series of lectures to theosophical audiences, Rudolf Steiner presented for the first time his reading of the miracle of the raising of Lazarus, what he called the first initiation of a human being directly by the Christ. Thus, by 1909, when Rudolf Steiner began the Luke Gospel lectures in Basel, members of the German section of the Theosophical Society, they had had a few years in which to live into Rudolf Steiner's reading of the Christ mystery. But those theosophists in 1909 in attendance at the Luke lectures, they would have been surprised and excited and even shocked to hear that, quote, the Luke Gospel contains the spiritual substance of Buddhism in a form accessible to all human souls who are receptive to the most essential human ideas and concepts. The challenge to that theosophical audience in 1909, and it is a similar challenge today, was to hear and understand the Buddha's teaching of the Dharma within the context of Rudolf Steiner's esoteric Christianity. And for most persons in that audience, the two worlds of Buddha and Christ were quite distinct and separate, if not entirely antithetical, as I said. Nevertheless, as Theosophy made evident, many Europeans felt attracted to Buddhism, so-called, simply because they were fed up with institutionalized Christianity and what many of them saw, rightly or wrongly, as Christianity's unpleasant, messy history of intolerance, criminal activity, and outright persecution of heretical views. Since the late 18th century, the world had been becoming more secular. Freedom and self-determination were guiding stars and buzzwords. Europeans had just gone through the 18th century age of enlightenment and revolution. People wanted to be self-reliant and think for themselves. They were ready for a teaching that provided a philosophy of freedom and ethical individualism, a philosophy that empowered the striving, self-reliant, awakened human being to seek the Grail on her own. Thank you very much. Inspired by the spirit of the time, Rudolf Steiner made this characteristic statement at the end of his book, Occult Science, and it spoke for the spirit of the time. We see that from the fruits of the wisdom of the Grail springs the highest ideal of human evolution conceivable for the human being, spiritualization attained by the human being through her own efforts. This is a very Buddhistic attitude when you get down to it. The historical Buddha styled himself as a teacher who wanted to teach persons to fish rather than just give them a fish. And this is true for the many generations of teachers who followed the Buddha in that tradition. The Buddha didn't want persons to rely on God or gods or spirit beings or gurus or charismatic teachers or sacred texts or superstitions. He wanted individuals to doubt everything. Buddhism is a path of rigorous inquiry and radical doubt. It is indeed a spiritual science. You don't just leave your mind and intellect in the cloakroom and bliss out on the mat. Buddhist practice is a rigorous training in how to think clearly and logically and consequentially, with the view to overcoming karmic stupidity and self-imposed ignorance. In this respect, it has quite a bit in common with the ethos of the European Age of Enlightenment and with the ethos of German idealist philosophy. I have talked about that in previous videos. I'm thinking now of Kant, Fichte, Schiller, Goethe, Novalis, Schlegel, etc. The list goes on. Buddhists call this spiritual scientific path of freedom and inquiry learning to have the right view. Right view is, in fact, where everything starts and ends, along with compassion for self and world. Test the truth for yourself, said the Buddha. Don't take it on faith from me or any glamorous authority, no matter what they tell you or what miracles you behold. The spiritual scientist Rudolf Steiner, to my knowledge, said the same thing repeatedly. He didn't want to be a guru, he wanted colleagues. Both Rudolf Steiner and Gautama Siddhartha were spiritual scientists who taught a similar path, one might well argue, a path of spiritual development that rests upon clear thinking, rigorous doubt, and contemplative practice. If we Google the phrase Buddha's dying words, you find right at the top of the results a hit that says, Buddha's dying words, the ultimate self-help advice. And what were those dying words? Buddha's dying words to his devoted student Ananda were, be a lamp unto yourself, Ananda. Be a refuge to yourself. Take yourself to no external refuge. Now, that's a rather Parsifalian attitude, and I'm speaking now of the poem Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach. It's a Parsifalian attitude especially when we add to it the practice of compassion and care for self and world. Uncle, what ails thee? Is the compassionate question, and gesture at the heart of Wolfram's poem, is it not? Anthroposophists are keen students of the Grail tradition and literature. A scholar practitioner of Rudolf Steiner's spiritual science will have read Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal many times, and she or he will have read or heard a lot of spiritual scientific commentary on the Grail and on Wolfram's Parsifal. Contemporary scholar practitioners of Rudolf Steiner's spiritual science generally do not have a problem seeing an essential Buddhistic meaning in Wolfram's poem, which is a poem whose title and whose hero's name, Parzival, memorializes a philosophy of the middle way, namely, a path right down the middle, finding a balance between extremes. But back in 1909, most German-speaking friends had learned about the Grail through the glamorous lens of Richard Wagner. And that's a whole story in itself. Wagner's mashup of Buddhism, Schopenhauer, Christianity, and Wagner's bold artistic rewrite of Wolfram's poem. But that's not a story for tonight, I hasten to assure you. I mention this only to say that much of the popular misunderstanding of Buddhism at that time in 1909 was colored by 19th century celebrity European egos, such as Schopenhauer and Wagner, and those who adored them and who imitated them. Almost no one at that time had access or sought access to teachers raised and schooled in authentic lineage traditions of the Dharma. There were no authentic Dharma centers with authentic lineage holders who taught from authentic texts. Everything was second-hand or third-hand or rumor. And even if you were crazy enough, like a young Parzival, to set off against all good advice, to set off on a quest to exotic lands, to find authentic teachings and the Grail, well, then the language and cultural barriers were nevertheless extremely high. The chances of succeeding were almost nil. My friends, no one had access to the vast libraries of authentic Dharma texts that exist for us today in incredible abundance. You know that you are living in a golden age in that regard. For many of Steiner's contemporaries, Buddhism was a fairy tale land of magic, mystery, miraculous events, and all-powerful hidden masters, some of whom were suspected of having insidious, veiled intentions for the Western world. Now, as I said, Rudolf Steiner set out to correct such misperceptions. But it was and it does remain a very challenging task. Old habits of thinking and karmic prejudice die hard. I don't think it is an overgeneralization to say that for a contemporary self-identifying Buddhist, Anthroposophy and the Theosophy on which it rests stands worlds apart from Dharma practice. Never the twain shall meet. Well, that's been my experience, at least, during my entire adult life. There's little to no dialogue between a contemporary scholar practitioner of the Buddha Dharma and a contemporary scholar practitioner of Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy, and vice versa, even though these are both spiritual sciences based on heart-mind thinking with similar assumptions about the integrity of the free and ethically striving individual. A citizen of our 21st century who inhabits both worlds and feels at home in both these worlds. That person is a very odd duck. Is something out of whack? Or should I say, maybe, is something quacked? Sorry for the joke. I know humor annoys some folks who think that serious anthroposophy deserves a very serious face and a very serious button-down demeanor. And I do certainly get that point of view. So with that in mind, and with a respectful literary bow toward the importance of being earnest, let me say then, as I finish up here, that one of the most challenging features of Rudolf Steiner's reading of the Christ mystery is contained in this cycle of lectures on the Luke Gospel. It's there when Rudolf Steiner speaks of the Buddha's influence at the birth of the Nathan Jesus child. Now, once again, those new to this topic may find this point quite confusing, and I refer you to the primary texts that I mentioned earlier at the beginning. Rudolf Steiner warned his audience about this confusion right at the beginning of Lecture 4, in the beginning of the cycle. He said, quote, "Please keep in mind that the lectures are cumulative. The content of each lecture builds upon the last. It will prove impossible to understand an individual lecture or lectures without considering the context supplied by other lectures." Rudolf Steiner made this comment because Lecture 3 and Lecture 4, they contain perhaps the most challenging aspects of his reading of the Christ mystery. And when I say reading, I of course refer to his reading of the Akashic Chronicle, which is his primary text, as we would call it. According to that reading of his primary text, we are told that, quote, "the Buddha's Nirmanakaya was revealed in our world during what the Luke Gospel describes as the Annunciation to the shepherds. We said that the rejuvenated Buddhist worldview flowed into the world through Christianity when the maternal astral body separated from the adolescent Jesus and was absorbed by the Buddha's Nirmanakaya. From that moment, a specific being united with the Buddha's Nirmanakaya, or spirit body, and the maternal astral body that surrounded the boy Jesus until age 12. Now, setting aside for the time being problems of terminology, for example, Rudolf Steiner's use of the term Nirmanakaya does not align with a contemporary Dharma practitioner's understanding of the term. But putting aside such differences for the moment, if we only focus on the main proposition that rejuvenated Buddhist worldview flowed into the world through Christianity, well, here we have more than enough matter to occupy our meditations for a very long time. And here, in fact, we encounter statements that signify a true mystery. And I use the word mystery as it's used in world wisdom traditions. Mystery, mystic, mysticism. At this point, some readers, Christian and or Buddhist and or anthroposophists, might roll their eyes, throw up their hands, and retreat to the bubble of their zendos or libraries or wherever. Rudolf Steiner, as mystical seer and spiritual scientist, challenged his audience, and he challenges us to entertain thoughts that we can find nowhere else in Dharma literature or Christian literature, to my knowledge, although from the perspective of Anthroposophy, this esoteric aspect of the Christ mystery is visible in the Western art history tradition if one has eyes to apprehend it. And perhaps I can explore this art historical topic in another lecture if causes and conditions are favorable. Of course, the objection can be voiced that this is all just mystical nonsense, not mystical fact. And it's often a difficult thesis to suggest that mystical experience or mystical intelligence/insight might be a very important aspect of our human beingness in the world. Nevertheless, all enduring wisdom traditions make room for this hypothesis. And for many, if not all, those wisdom traditions, it is not a hypothesis, but a mystical fact. I'll close tonight with a quote by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, that you can find in the book Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions, which is a prelude volume to the 10-volume series on Buddhism that has the title The Library of Wisdom and Compassion. I'll quote an extended passage to conclude this talk. I'm doing so because those who are familiar with Rudolf Steiner's lectures on the Luke Gospel, especially the challenging content in Lecture 3 and Lecture 4, they may find some congruency in these words, despite differences in terminology. First, I'll read Rudolf Steiner from the Luke Gospel cycle. We can say, therefore, that the Buddha's Nirmanakaya, in the form of the angelic hosts, appeared to the shepherds. The Buddha's radiance streamed into the Nirmanakaya that was revealed to the shepherds. After this appearance, however, the Buddha continued to seek ways of influencing events taking place in Palestine at this very important time. And now the quote from His Holiness. The difference in how the Pali and Sanskrit traditions describe the Buddha need not confuse us. We don't have to choose one view over the other. Rather, we can see which view inspires us at a particular time. When we feel discouraged, thinking of Siddhartha Gautama as having been an ordinary being who faced the same difficulties on the path as we do, that is helpful. Just as he diligently practiced the path and attained awakening, so can we. At other times, seeing Buddha as one who attained awakening eons ago and appeared in our world as an emanation body, well, that is more helpful. This view gives us the feeling of being cared for by many Buddhas who are present to guide us. When I contemplate the Buddha's qualities, as depicted in the early Pali Suttas, it seems his abilities, as portrayed in the Sanskrit sutras, are a natural extension of those. For example, the Buddha tells Ananda that he remembers attending many hundreds of assemblies of persons in the ruling caste, where he sat and spoke with them. To do this, he adopted their appearance and speech, and instructed, inspired, and delighted them with Dhamma discourses. Yet these people did not know who he was, and wondered whether he was a deva, celestial being, or a human being. Having instructed them, he disappeared. The Buddha says the same about his actions in assemblies of Brahmins, householders, ascetics, and devas. This passage reminds me of the activities of a Buddha's emanation body. Nowhere in either the Pali or Sanskrit sutras is the Buddha seen as either omnipotent or as a creator. He does not seek our worship, and we do not have to propitiate him to gain boons. He does not reward those who follow his teachings and punish those who don't. The Buddha described the path to awakening from his own experience. His intention is only to benefit sentient beings according to their individual inclinations and temperament. Thank you for your attention and for your interest in Romanticism and for your interest in the section for the literary arts and humanities. Good night.